To understand modern medicine, we must return to a time when treating the sick was an act of courage. In 1600, seeking a doctor was not a guarantee of healing. It was a risk.
In the year 1600, illness was more than a physical condition. It was a verdict. To fall sick in early modern Europe meant entering a world ruled by fear, belief, and uncertainty. Disease was not simply something that happened to the body. It was something that meant something. A sign of imbalance, a warning, sometimes a punishment. Cities were expanding, but they were not designed for health. Narrow streets trapped moisture and waste. Animals roamed freely among people. Refuse piled near homes. Clean water was scarce, and few questioned its role in sickness. Disease moved invisibly, silently, unchecked. No one knew about bacteria. No one spoke of viruses. Contagion, as a scientific concept, did not yet exist. Instead, people feared corrupted air. Miasma, invisible vapors believed to rise from rot, filth, and death itself. If the air was bad, the body would follow. Medicine rested on ancient authority. For centuries, European doctors had relied on texts written long before their time. The works of Galen and Hippocrates shaped nearly every diagnosis and treatment. Their ideas were not questioned, they were inherited. According to this tradition, the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Disease meant excess or deficiency. Treatment, therefore, aimed not at causes, but at correction. This belief made one practice nearly universal: bloodletting. From headaches to fevers, from infections to emotional distress, blood was drawn in the hope of restoring harmony. Veins were opened, bowls filled, strength drained away. The logic was simple and terrifying. If illness came from excess, removal must bring relief. There was no anesthesia. Pain was expected, endured, sometimes welcomed. Suffering was not always seen as failure, but as part of the cure. Doctors rarely touched their patients. They observed from a distance, asked questions, and inspected bodily fluids, especially urine, whose color and smell were thought to reveal the body's inner state. Hands-on procedures were left to surgeons, men of lower status, often trained through apprenticeship rather than university. Many surgeons were also barbers. The same hands that shaved faces could extract teeth, drain abscesses, or amputate limbs. Instruments were reused without sterilization. Wounds often became worse than the illnesses they were meant to cure. For the wealthy, physicians offered prestige and ritual. For the poor, medicine looked very different. Home remedies, herbs, prayers, charms, midwives and local healers provided care based on experience rather than theory. Some treatments worked by chance, many did not, but they were trusted because they were familiar. Death was common, childhood was fragile, adulthood uncertain, old age rare. And yet within this fragile world, medicine believed itself wise because it followed the ancients. To doubt them was not merely intellectual rebellion, it was dangerous. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. Quietly, reluctantly, the body itself was starting to speak. By 1600, medicine was not only a practice, it was a hierarchy. Knowledge flowed downward from books to bodies, not the other way around. What had been written centuries earlier carried more weight than what could be seen in the present. To challenge the old texts was to challenge universities, churches, and the social order itself. The human body remained a sacred object. Opening it was controversial, sometimes forbidden. Dissection, when allowed, was tightly controlled and highly symbolic. Bodies were scarce and usually belonged to executed criminals, whose punishment extended beyond death. Knowledge came at a moral cost. Anatomical theaters began to appear in major European cities, circular rooms filled with students and officials watching as a body was opened. These events were part science, part ritual. A professor would read from a classical text while an assistant performed the cuts. The body was expected to confirm the book, never to contradict it. But slowly, contradictions appeared. Organs did not always match descriptions. Structures were different. The body refused to obey theory. Some physicians noticed, most stayed silent. Careers depended on obedience. Medicine was not a space for rebellion. Outside academic halls, epidemics returned again and again. Plague outbreaks emptied neighborhoods. Families were sealed inside their homes. Bells marked the dead. Fear shaped behavior more than knowledge. People burned herbs, avoided strangers, and prayed harder. Doctors became symbols of both hope and dread. Their long robes and strange masks, with beak-like noses filled with aromatic plants, were meant to protect them from poisoned air. To patients, their arrival could mean treatment or isolation. Illness carried moral weight. Sickness was often interpreted as punishment or testing. The body reflected the soul. Healing, therefore, required not only medicine, but repentance. Pain was endured as meaning, not merely sensation. Women faced particular risk. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in life. Midwives held practical knowledge passed through generations, yet they operated outside official medicine. In times of crisis, that made them vulnerable. A failed birth could become an accusation. Fear turned easily into blame. And still, beneath all this suffering, a quiet transformation was underway. Some physicians began to observe rather than assume, to record rather than recite, to notice patterns rather than repeat dogma. Medicine stood at a threshold. One foot remained in the ancient world, bound by authority, faith, and fear. The other hesitated, uncertain, at the edge of something new. A different way of understanding the body was coming, slowly, and at great cost. At the dawn of the 17th century, Europe stood suspended between two worlds. One was shaped by faith, tradition, and obedience. The other, still forming, was driven by curiosity, doubt, and observation. Medicine existed exactly at that intersection. Doctors prayed before treating patients. Remedies were prescribed alongside scripture. Illness was explained through both the body and the soul. To heal meant not only restoring balance, but respecting divine order. Medicine could assist, but never challenge God. Yet the body itself was becoming harder to ignore. A quiet intellectual shift had begun decades earlier. In the mid-16th century, Andreas Vesalius had dared to do something radical. He dissected human bodies personally, rather than relying on assistance. What he saw contradicted centuries of accepted knowledge. Galen, whose authority dominated medicine, had based much of his anatomy on animals, not humans. Vesalius published his findings with detailed illustrations. Muscles, bones, organs drawn with unprecedented precision. His work did not destroy the old system overnight, but it weakened its foundations. By 1600, his ideas circulated quietly through Europe, admired by some, condemned by others. Universities reacted cautiously. Dissections were allowed but controlled. Knowledge advanced slowly, constrained by fear of error and fear of punishment. To be wrong was dangerous. To challenge tradition was worse. Medical education remained rigid. Students memorized texts in Latin. Questioning was discouraged. Authority mattered more than evidence. And yet, once a student had seen inside a body, something changed. Memory competed with doctrine. Flesh challenged words. Outside academic life, suffering continued unabated. Infections spread quickly. Wounds festered. Fevers came and went without explanation. Doctors could name diseases, but not causes. Treatment often weakened patients further. Hospitals were not places of recovery. They were shelters for the poor, the sick, and the dying. Cleanliness was minimal. Beds were shared. Air was thick with illness. Survival depended more on chance than care. Still, patterns emerged. Some patients recovered despite minimal intervention. Others declined rapidly under aggressive treatment. quietly, the idea formed that medicine itself could cause harm. But faith remained the dominant lens. Recovery was attributed to divine mercy, death to divine will. Medicine existed under this shadow, careful not to claim too much power. Certainty belonged to God. The body was no longer completely sacred, but it was not yet free. Medicine in 1600 was learning to look, while still afraid of what it might see. Beyond universities and official medicine, healing lived in kitchens, villages, and whispered knowledge. Most people in 1600 would never be treated by a university-trained physician. Care came instead from midwives, local healers, herbalists, and family traditions passed from one generation to the next. This medicine was practical, not theoretical. It relied on observation, repetition, and memory. What seemed to help was kept. What failed was quietly forgotten or explained through faith. Success was attributed to God's favor, failure to fate. Midwives occupied a fragile position. They understood childbirth, women's bodies, and the rhythms of life in ways books did not describe. They saved lives regularly, yet remained outside institutions. Their knowledge was respected in private and distrusted in public. In moments of fear, respect could turn into suspicion. The boundary between medicine and superstition was thin. Amulets were worn for protection. Prayers were spoken over wounds. Certain words were believed to carry healing power. A cure did not need to be understood to be believed. Belief itself was part of the treatment. Physicians, meanwhile, guarded their authority through language and distance. Latin preserved hierarchy. Most patients could not understand what was being said about their own bodies. Mystery reinforced power. Confidence mattered more than certainty. But something subtle was changing. Some doctors began to write things down. Case after case. Symptoms, outcomes, small notebooks filled with observations rather than quotations. This habit was revolutionary, even if it appeared harmless. Knowledge was slowly shifting from inheritance to experience. Epidemics accelerated this change. Plague outbreaks forced cities to act, even without understanding why certain measures worked. Quarantine became common. Ships waited offshore. Homes were sealed. Movement was restricted. These actions saved lives, not because of theory, but because of results. Medicine was learning without realizing it. Doctors in long coats and beaked masks became symbols of the age. Their clothing was meant to protect them from poisoned air, but also marked them as agents of authority. Their arrival brought hope, fear, and isolation. Treatment could mean survival, or separation from family. Trust in medicine remained fragile. Many feared doctors as much as disease. Intervention could weaken the body. Inaction sometimes seemed safer. Slowly, a dangerous question formed. What if medicine itself was part of the problem? By the early 1600s, medicine stood in uneasy balance. Faith still explained the world. Tradition still ruled education. But experience was pressing harder each year. Healing was no longer only about belief. It was becoming about evidence, even if no one yet dared to say the word. By the middle of the 17th century, medicine was no longer standing still. It was moving, cautiously, unevenly, and often in the shadows. Fear still ruled daily life, but curiosity had begun to challenge obedience. Power structures resisted change, yet experimentation found ways to exist within them. One of the greatest obstacles was authority itself. Medical knowledge was controlled by universities, guilds, and religious institutions. Advancement depended not on discovery, but on conformity. To heal was important. To obey was essential. Still, the body continued to defy expectation. Some physicians began to experiment quietly. They compared treatments. They altered doses. They observed what happened when they did nothing at all. These were not controlled experiments by modern standards, but they marked a critical shift. Outcomes began to matter more than tradition. Autopsies became slightly more common, not public spectacles, but private examinations. Doctors sought answers in silence, away from scrutiny. Each opened body revealed the same truth. The human form was complex, consistent, and far more logical than ancient theory suggested. Disease, however, remained a mystery. Without knowledge of microbes, physicians searched for causes everywhere else. In the stars, in weather patterns, in emotions, in morality. Astrology still influenced diagnosis. Certain days were considered safer for treatment than others. The body was seen as part of a cosmic order. Power also shaped who received care. The wealthy enjoyed attention, rest, and personalized treatment. The poor were treated in overcrowded hospitals or not at all. Medical progress, when it occurred, rarely benefited everyone equally. Fear was most visible during epidemics. When disease spread, trust collapsed. Neighbors avoided one another. Families were separated. Authorities imposed measures without explanation. Medicine became a tool of control as much as care. And yet, within this fear, new ideas gained ground. One of the most revolutionary concepts to emerge was circulation. In 1628, William Harvey published findings that challenged centuries of belief. He argued that blood did not ebb and flow endlessly through the body, but moved in a continuous circuit driven by the heart. This idea directly contradicted Galen. At first, it was rejected, then debated, then slowly accepted. Harvey's work did not end bloodletting, but it weakened its theoretical foundation. For the first time, a fundamental bodily process was explained through observation and experiment, not inherited authority. It was a turning point. Medicine had crossed a line. It had proven that the ancients could be wrong, and that truth could be discovered. But progress brought danger. To know more was to risk more. Physicians who embraced new ideas faced ridicule, loss of position, even accusations of heresy. Innovation required courage, patience, and silence. Medicine was no longer merely repeating the past, it was testing it. And once tested, the old world could not fully survive. As new ideas slowly entered medical thought, resistance hardened. Many physicians accepted discoveries in theory but refused to change practice. Bloodletting continued. Old remedies endured. Habit proved stronger than evidence. Medicine advanced unevenly, progressive in books, conservative at the bedside. Experimentation remained risky. There were no ethical standards, no clear boundaries. Patients rarely gave consent as we understand it today. Treatment was decided by authority, not agreement. The body was still something acted upon, not consulted. At the same time, scientific instruments began to appear. Early microscopes offered glimpses of a hidden world, though their significance was not yet understood. They revealed structure without explanation, detail without meaning. Still, they hinted that reality extended beyond what the eye alone could see. Chemistry also entered medicine, challenging traditional theory. Some practitioners began to question the dominance of humors and turned instead to substances, minerals, compounds, reactions. Illness was increasingly seen as something material, not purely symbolic. This shift was controversial, but irreversible. Medicine became divided. On one side stood tradition, balance, authority, inherited truth. On the other stood experiment, observation, testing, uncertainty. Neither side fully won. The tension defined the age. Fear continued to shape public perception. When cures failed, blame followed. Physicians were accused of arrogance, healers of deceit, midwives of malice. Knowledge did not protect against suspicion. In times of crisis, understanding mattered less than reassurance. Yet progress continued, quietly accumulating. More notes, more comparisons, more recognition that the body behaved consistently, regardless of belief. Disease followed patterns. Recovery followed patterns. Nature obeyed rules, even if they were not yet known. Medicine was becoming something new, not yet modern, but no longer ancient. It was learning to accept uncertainty, and in doing so, it was learning to grow. By the late 17th century, medicine was no longer defined solely by what it had inherited. It was beginning to be shaped by what it could prove. The shift was incomplete, fragile, and often contested, but it was real. Observation had gained legitimacy. Physicians increasingly trusted what they could see, measure, and repeat. Case notes multiplied. Comparisons replaced assumptions. Knowledge slowly moved from reverence to verification. The body was no longer just a symbol. It was a system. Scientific thinking spread beyond anatomy. Natural philosophers began to question how substances interacted, how air behaved, how the heart functioned as a mechanism rather than a mystery. Chemistry entered medicine not as magic, but as process. Treatments were tested, results were noted. Failure became informative. Institutions began to change. Scientific societies formed. Ideas circulated through letters and publications. Debate replaced silence. Error became something to correct, not conceal. Medicine was learning to argue with itself, yet the past did not disappear. Bloodletting remained common. Old theories lingered in practice. Change was uneven and slow. Progress did not arrive as revolution, but as accumulation. Hospitals improved incrementally. Cleanliness was discussed, though not fully understood. Isolation practices expanded. Quarantine was refined. These measures worked before their reasons were known. Medicine learned that effectiveness could precede explanation. Most importantly, the authority of ancient texts weakened. They were still respected, but no longer untouchable. A physician could now question without immediate ruin. Knowledge became provisional. Truth became something to pursue, not inherit. Medicine had not yet discovered germs. It had not mastered surgery. It could not reliably cure infection. But it had learned something essential. The body followed natural laws, and laws could be studied. This realization marked a quiet birth. The birth of modern medicine. The medicine of 1600 did not fail because its practitioners lacked intelligence or care. It failed because it inherited certainty in a world that demanded curiosity. For centuries, healing had been guided by reverence for the past. Progress began only when doubt was allowed to exist. By the end of the 17th century, medicine had not yet become safe, but it had become honest. Physicians no longer claimed complete understanding. They admitted uncertainty. They compared results. They accepted that knowledge could change. This humility, more than any single discovery, transformed the field. The body was no longer a moral lesson or a divine riddle. It was a living system, governed by patterns, vulnerable to intervention, capable of recovery. Disease was increasingly seen as a physical process, not a spiritual verdict. This shift altered society's relationship with illness. Fear remained, but it was joined by inquiry. Authority remained, but it faced challenge. Medicine became a conversation rather than a command. The cost of this transformation was high. Countless lives were lost along the way. Mistakes were made. Suffering was endured. Progress was slow, uneven, and often invisible to those living through it. But the direction had changed, from tradition to evidence, from obedience to observation, from certainty to understanding. The foundations of modern medicine were laid not in moments of triumph, but in centuries of questioning, in the courage to look at the body as it truly was, not as books described it. The world of 1600 stands far from our own, yet its struggle feels familiar, between fear and knowledge, between belief and proof, between what is known and what must still be learned. Modern medicine did not begin with answers. It began with the courage to ask.